Hi BookTube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to take a bit of time to talk about the Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell. I read it quite recently. I started the first book back in May and finished the last book I think towards the end of June. And it's been really a really quite wonderful reading experience, and I have sort of mixed sort of feelings about some portions of it, but on the whole, I really loved it and would really recommend it. And so what I want to do in this video is I'll give you a brief overview of the quartet. I'll give you a quick rundown on many of the characters, and then we'll go book by book. And I'll just give you some impressions, a bit of an overview of each book, and I'll also read the opening of each book as well, just to give you a taste for the writing. So the Alexandria Quartet, being a quartet, is made up of 4 novels. The first novel is Justine. This came out in 1957, I believe, and then it was followed the next year by the next 2 novels. So there's Balthazar and Mount Olive. And Durrell described these 3 books as sort of being siblings, and that Balthazar and Mount Olive, they're not really sequels to Justine, but they're sort of related to Justine, and really it's the same events from different perspectives. Each book does sort of describe its own unique events, though there are things that you only see in each book, since they are different perspectives. However, you are getting through the 3 books a larger picture of the the whole sort of this whole sort of period in time. And then the last book is Clear, which is the only sort of truly speaking sequel in the quartet, and it's set 6 years after the events of the main events of the first 3 books. So I've heard people say that the first 3 books, you have your 3 dimensions in space, and then it's only here that we have our dimension in time. I'm not entirely sure how strongly that comes across in the books, but fair enough. You can sort of make that that sort of analogy there. Very roughly speaking, what is the Alexandria Quartet? What is it about? As you may have guessed, it's about the city of Alexandria. It's set in the years leading up to, during, and then just after the Second World War. Most of the action of the quartet is before the Second World War. It's only really in the last book that we get stuff that happens during and after the war. And it's about this very interconnected, on the whole quite bohemian group of characters. And I've heard it said that they're kind of trying to discover themselves through each other, whether that's sort of philosophically through conversations. Darley, one of our main narrators in the quartet, has there are a couple of people that he'll talk to about writing, particularly a character called Pursewarden, who we'll get to in a bit. But also the other way they're trying to discover themselves is through sex, through relationships as well. So again, that's something worth bearing in mind if infidelity in books is something you find annoying. It's just worth pointing out. But it is also worth pointing out that although it is very much about sexual relationships, or as Durrell would put it, about modern love, it's not terribly explicit either. It's more about emotionally how all of this stuff impacts people, which I found really interesting, and really honest in the way it's portrayed. So very quickly, I'd say our core cast of characters, there are way more characters than the ones I'm going to put in here. But these are just a few of the principal characters. So first up, we've got Darley. So he's our narrator in Justine. He's kind of the arc narrator of the second book, Balthazar, and then the last book, Clear, is also narrated by him. Next two characters are female characters that he has close relationships to. So the first is Melissa. She's a Greek native to Alexandria. She's a dancer and essentially also a prostitute. And Darley is relatively relaxed about this relationship. At that point, he's quite scraped for cash, and he sort of realizes that's the way that they're going to be making money. Although there is always the dream that eventually she won't have to do it. And the other couple of characters then that we'll be meeting, we've got Justine, who is sort of part of the Jewish contingent of the city, and Nassim, part of the Coptic contingent of the city. And Nassim and Justine are married, and the main plot in Justine is an affair that Darley has with Justine. Nassim has a brother called Nuruz. As the quartet goes on, he becomes a much more important character. He's very much in the background to begin with. Unlike most of the characters in here, Nuruz really doesn't like Alexandria. He prefers staying on his ancestral family estate. And so between him and Nassim, there's a bit of a Isaac and Esau thing going on. One being a bit more domestic, maybe the other one being out in the world. I'm not sure, but yeah, there's certainly an interesting dynamic between the two brothers. The next character, and I think my favourite character in the whole quartet, is Clea. Again, I think she's a Greek native to the city. I might have misremembered there. She's certainly got deep roots in the city and knows many of the natives very natives, very, very closely. She's an artist, and she's very independent. And one of my favourite moments in the whole quartet is a passage describing her independence. I think it's in Justine, and it's just going through. It's describing the small flat that she lives in by herself, and kind of describing her contentedness with being alone and single and independent. And it also describes her small but well-stocked and well-loved bookcase as well. So as a reader and book lover, then yeah, that's a delight for me as well. Next up, we have Warden, who I've already mentioned. He's another artist, another writer, really the closest thing to a kind of celebrity writer in the whole book. He also works sort of diplomatically as well. He's sort of attached to the embassy. That's his day job. But he's very much based on Wyndham Lewis, I found out later. And I think he's a very interesting character where he's sort of everyone around him knows he's a really talented artist, a really he's got it, and people recognise that. And sometimes he can be sensitive, and he can say the right thing at the right time sometimes. But he can be a bit of a brute as well. And so I find it quite funny that he's actually based on Wyndham Lewis, and actually from how physically he's described in the book, it is very close to this photograph. The other character, a sort of colleague of Warden, is Mount Olive, David Mount Olive, who is the ambassador, the British ambassador in Egypt. He's completely absent in the first book, briefly mentioned in the second, and then the third book suddenly is his story. We'll get into that. Then we have Balthazar, another sort of member of the Jewish contingent of the city. So again, has roots in the city, knows lots of people, and is a really sort of generous, open character. But there's a lot more to him than you might think. And then the last character I wanted to at least mention, although he's not quite as intrinsic as some of the other characters, but he is a good friend to many of them and something that connects quite a few of them. And his name is Scobie, and he's an old sea dog, and he's just an eccentric that particularly Darley and Clea really get on with, and they love to hear him talk. And a rather odd habit he has is he likes to put on women's clothes and go down to the docks, down to the harbour, to get the attention of young sailors. So that's a kind of taste of the kind of characters we have in this book, the kind of colour and the vibrancy of life that we have. I think just through this slim selection of characters, you're getting a sort of taste of the sort of diversity, the sort of cosmopolitanism of Alexandria at the time. We have, Nassim and Nowruz, who are Coptic, Greek characters, Jewish characters, and then sort of British colonial characters. There are also French colonial characters. Noticeably, and it is worth saying, really, most of the Arabic characters in the book are sort of side characters, so it's just something that's worth noticing. And the characters are really the interesting thing in the book. Durrell wasn't terribly interested in plot. It wasn't something that motivated him as a reader or as a writer. And so although there are some interesting plot developments, obviously, since they kind of have to be for it to be a novel, for it to be a series of novels. But I think that the thing that motivates you, the thing that sort of keeps you going through the quartet, is the layering of characters and the way that the characters sort of change in different lights. And that's what he does remarkably. So we'll have a quick look at each book. I'll read the beginning of each book to give you a taste. And we'll start off with Justine, which I still think is the best written out of all of them. Although it's quite hard. Now I've read the other three, it's hard to remember what happens in Justine and what happens in the other books. And so there's certainly something I'll be rereading. So apologies if I can't give an accurate synopsis. Even if you did know exactly what happened in which book and had it all mapped out, it wouldn't make much sense anyway. But it's worth saying before we jump in that, there are a few things at the beginning that I'd like to jump in with. The first is a little note at the beginning of Justine that says, "The characters in this novel, the first of a series, are all inventions together with the personality of the narrator and bear no resemblance to living persons. Only the city is real," which is really intriguing since, in a way, the city is also imaginary. But I have heard it said that for people who were actually alive in this period and were looking back at it, it's a relatively accurate portrayal of Alexandria. Then we've got two epigraphs, and these are really intriguing. That there are epigraphs in the rest of them, but I think it's these two at the beginning of Justine that are the most intriguing. The first here is from Sigmund Freud in a letter where he says, "I am accustoming myself to the idea of regarding every sexual act as a process in which 4 persons are involved. We shall have a lot to discuss about that." And part of the whole thing, maybe in the whole quartet, is working out who those 4 people are. Maybe there are more than 4 people, or maybe it's not quite what we're seeing at first. So that's certainly an intriguing element of the quartet. It's also very intriguing that we have 4 persons who are involved, and then we have a quartet of books, each of which names, has one of the main characters as the title of the book. And I'll be very quick to add that these 4 people are in no way, in at least the 4 of them together, aren't in a sexual relationship together. But it is interesting that the 4 books have their own relationship, and that's sort of mirroring this other relationship that is being alluded to in the epigraph. And then we've got an epigraph from none other than the Marquis de Sade, from his book also called Justine. He says this: "There are 2 positions available to us, either crime, which renders us happy, or the noose, which prevents us from being unhappy. I ask whether there can be any hesitation, lovely Therese, and where will your little mind find an argument able to combat that one?" So an intriguing one there about, what we're going to go. Are we going to go for pleasure, which may also be transgressive, or are we going to go for death or kind of resignation, which, although it's an end to all of that, it is not unhappiness, I suppose. So a really intriguing pair of epigraphs to have in the back of your head as you're diving into Justine. So I'll read you the opening. And really, this opening, I've read it in other videos before, but it is really showing you the best of what you can get in terms of writing, and the vivid, intense descriptions that you can get. So this is how Justine opens. "The sea is high again today, with a thrilling flush of wind. In the midst of winter, you can feel the inventions of spring. A sky of hot nude pearl until midday, crickets in sheltered places, and now the wind unpacking the great plains, ransacking the great plains." And yeah, it goes on, and yeah, as I said, a lot of what you're enjoying the most as you're going through here, it is the writing, are the descriptions, and it's interesting where the whole idea with this first book with Justine is that it's the novel of another writer. So supposedly this is a novel written by Darley. He's a writer and a teacher, and he's writing Justine after the main events of the first 3 books have taken place. He's no longer in Alexandria. He's removed himself to a relatively remote Greek island with a child. And I'll just throw in one little spoiler in here. It's not much of a spoiler, that the child is is the child of Melissa, who he was in a relationship with, and Nassim, the husband of Justine, who Darley will go on to have an affair with. So we have our quartet of characters in that relationship, potentially, as alluded to in that quotation from Freud. And he's gone there to make sense of things. He's gone to this island to make sense of things, and to write about his relationship with Melissa and with Justine. He's not there with Melissa. We find out very quickly that Melissa has died, and that she was really unwell. And so again, there's another layer of potential guilt and things like that. Darley went to Alexandria to be a teacher. One of the things I find really intriguing in Justine, in particular, as a lover and enjoyer of poetry, is Darley's obsession with C.P. Cavafy. And C.P. Cavafy was a Greek-speaking poet who lived in Alexandria and is, sort of the almost like the patron poet of Alexandria, and so he seems to very much haunt the whole city in reality, and he also haunts the novel Justine. It's full of allusions to him, full of quotations of his poems, and so I just thought I'd show this as well. And it's through a lecture that he's giving on C.P. Cavafy that he meets Nassim and Justine, and he befriends them, and then the affair with Justine goes on. And sort of roughly speaking, that's the plot. It's full of anecdotes of escapades with other characters. It's not written chronologically at all, and it's written in these small little snippets. So I'll maybe try and show you a page where it shows you that quite well. Quite often, you don't get a fragment that's more than a couple of pages. There are some longer bits, but as you can see there, we've got a little page break there, and then just there we have another page break. And so it's these short, fleeting fragments of experience that we're being given, and he's writing them not chronologically, but he's sort of going through what matters to him most, what seems more significant each time. And so he's very much layering up the characters as you're going through. So it's very confusing initially. I'd love to come back to this soon and see if I can make more sense of it the second time round. Because in terms of writing, it was my favourite. And I think it's the most vivid, the lushest of the four books. That might account for the fact that it's very much Dali's perspective, and at this point he knows very little, and so there's sort of less chance of him being disillusioned, I suppose. So that's Justine, the first book. That's followed up by Balthazar, and the framing narrative of Balthazar is that Dali has just sent the manuscript of Justine. He's just finished it, he's just written it, and he sends it off to his friend Balthazar, who we get to know a bit in Justine. He's a doctor. He lets Clea paint pictures of injuries, and Clea makes death masks of patients who have died in the hospital and things like that. So although he's a doctor, he's quite almost like a patron of the arts in a strange way. Very generous character, very open character, and he's also a leader of a Kabbalistic study group as well, which is another really odd layer to the quartet. So Balthazar receives this manuscript, and then he comes to visit Dali, and he has annotated the manuscript. And so the idea of this is that we're getting more of the story through Balthazar's annotations, or as he calls it, his interlinear. And so there are sections in here where it feels a little more like a third person narrative, and I think that's because it's being sort of knitted together through Balthazar's perspective, if that makes any sense. I found this a little more, I was going to say a little more confusing than Justine. Justine was confusing in its own way, I suppose, but it was hard to, at least initially, I couldn't quite tell whose perspective it was supposed to be at certain points. But I think you get used to it, and again, the further into the quartet you get, the more these various pieces come together. Although narratively it seems a little more straightforward than Justine as well. It feels slightly more chronological, and so that certainly helps. And it has some really lovely, really long set pieces in here as well. So I'll read you a bit then from the beginning of this book. And what I like here is that it's in conversation with the very end of Justine, and I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. So this is how Balthazar begins. Landscape tones, brown to bronze, steep skyline, low cloud, pearl ground with shadowed oyster and violet reflections. The lion dust of desert, prophets' tombs turned to zinc and copper at sunset on the ancient lake, its huge sand faults like watermarks from the air, green and citron giving to gunmetal, to a single plum-dark sail, moist, palpitant, sticky-winged nymph. Taposiris is dead among its tumbling columns and sea marks, vanishing the harpoon men. Mariotis under a sky of hot lilac. So again, some really lovely, vivid writing there to start us off. But that is essentially taken from a section at the very end of Justine called Work Notes, which are things sort of, for the writer supposedly to work from. So this is how it goes at the end of Justine. Landscape tones, steep skylines, low cloud, pearl ground with shadows in oyster and violet. Acidae, on the lake, gunmetal and lemon. Summer, sand lilac sky. Autumn, swollen bruised greys. Winter, freezing white sand, clear skies, magnificent starscapes. And so you can already see there in Justine it's much shorter, much more to the point. In Balthazar it's expanded and there's much more detail, and that's very much what's going on in Balthazar. It's Justine being suddenly expanded, and it's really wonderful. And again, knowing what I know now, having read the whole thing, I'm feeling quite excited to reread them. And apologies if I'm not doing a terribly good job of going through a kind of synopsis of the plot, because it's quite hard to do. In Balthazar, we particularly get a bit more insight into the lives of Nessim and Nuruz, and certainly in this book and in the next book, you kind of see how important they are and how much they're doing, and certainly the plottiest elements of the quartet really concern Nessim and Nuruz. So then moving on then to Mount Olive, the third book. The most conventional, it's the only one of the three that's sort of completely in a third-person narrative, and it concerns David Mount Olive, an ambassador, and it's really intriguing, really interesting. I'll just go ahead and read the beginning straight away because it gives us a bit of a context into his past and who he is. As a junior of exceptional promise, he had been sent to Egypt for a year in order to improve his Arabic, and found himself attached to the High Commission as a sort of scribe to await his first diplomatic posting. But he was already conducting himself as a young secretary of legation, fully aware of the responsibilities of future office. Only somehow today it was rather more difficult than usual to be reserved. So exciting had the fish drive become. And then it goes on to one of my favourite sections in the whole quartet, to this fish drive, this sort of fishing trip that he's on. And he's there, as it said, he's still waiting his first diplomatic post, but he's gone to Egypt to improve on his Arabic, and he's staying with a family called the Hosnanis, and this family, the two teenage, I think, children there, certainly young adults just before university age, we find out are Nassim and Nuruz. And so our character, who will eventually become the ambassador to Egypt, David Mountolive, knew two of our principal characters when they were younger. And what we have then is this, this complication between our personal and official lives going on and being explored in Mount Olive. Also, Mount Olive, he has an affair with their mother, with Nassim and Nuruz's mother, and that becomes the most important relationship of his life, kind of shaping his life, and that sort of hanging over everything that happens throughout this book. So eventually he does find himself posted to Alexandria, and we're seeing again a lot of the events that happened in Justine and in Balthazar, but from a very official perspective. And we're getting to see Purse Warden again in much more detail. We're seeing what his work at the embassy entails, what he knows, and we're seeing much more of what his relationship with some of these other characters was. So yeah, but very, very intriguing. I actually really enjoyed this. I was expecting it to be my least favourite from the quartet. I can't really actually judge which one is my least favourite, but I really enjoyed it. It has its own tone, certainly a very different approach to the other books, but just a really, I thought, really lovely and poignant book. And then we move on to the last book, to Clear. So that the first three books, as I said, were siblings. Justine published in 1957, the other two in 1958, and then Clear comes out in 1960. So there's a bit of a gap, in the time it took for Durrell to write it, and there's this moves forward in time as well. It begins 6 years after the main events that we've been seeing, and then it sort of moves on further away as well. I think a couple of years on. And I'll just jump straight in and read the opening of Clear, because again it gives us a bit of context as to what's going on in the book as a whole. So it says this: the oranges were more plentiful than usual that year. They glowed in their arbours of burnished green leaf like lanterns, flickering up there among the sunny woods. It was as if they were eager to celebrate our departure from the little island, for at last the long-awaited message from Nassim had come, like a summons back to the underworld, a message which was to draw me back inexorably to the one city which for me always hovered between illusion and reality, between the substance and the poetic images which its very name aroused in me. A memory, I told myself, which had been falsified by the desires and intuitions only as yet half realized on paper. Alexandria, the capital of memory. All the writing which I had borrowed from the living and from the dead, until I myself had become a sort of postscript to a letter which was never ended, never posted. And so there we have, I think that does give us a good idea of the tone of Clear. There's trying to think of the right words. It's not a nostalgia. It's quite a bittersweet feeling. There's this return to a place that is full of beautiful memories. And it's also full of some painful memories. There's celebration in this book, and there's commiseration in this book. And the characters from the first few books have changed a lot I think Darley has changed a lot in what he wants, but it's a really lovely way to end the quartet, very much about trying to grow as a person, trying to move on as well. So as he says at the beginning there, they're going back to Alexandria. He's going back with this child, this daughter of Melissa and Nassim, and Nassim has decided he wants to bring her up. He wants her with him and Justine at home, and he's living on the family estate just outside Alexandria. And so that's that's what sort of instigates the book. That's what gets things rolling. And Darley once again finds himself in Alexandria, seeing how time and the war has changed his old friends and acquaintances. And the main focus of the book is that he sort of restarts his friendship with Clea, and they start a relationship. And in their own way, they're both trying to move forward personally and artistically, but they're both kind of stunted in that respect. And so, really, what's going on is they're still trying to explore the past, still can't quite get past the past, and that's sort of what's going on in their relationship a bit, I think. Again, I don't really want to sort of give too much away. I feel like even though this is written in a similar way to Justine and Balthazar, once you've read Mount Olive, you get the impression that's very much rubbed on Clea, and although it's all from Darley's perspective, it's much more conventional again, and not nearly as fragmentary as the first two books. And I think I'll leave it there. I was very happy with where it went. I felt like I was really growing to love and sort of grow in an attachment to these characters, and so I think that sort of attests to what Durrell's been able to accomplish in these books. So how does it work as a whole? What's going on? I think, as I said, I think that idea of dimension, that idea of space and then time, kind of works. For me, if I had to sum up the Alexandria Quartet, I'd say it's the closest thing to reading In Search of Lost Time by Proust that I've read since then. And in a way, it is In Search of Lost Time. It's people making sense of their lives, of the past. But I think more than that, it's in search of a lost or even just imagined place. At the beginning of Justine, it says only the city is real. And yet, still, the city is a kind of fantasy, I think. What draws Darley to Alexandria is the poetry of C.P. Cavafy and the version of the city that is evoked in those poems. And that may have been very real in a certain time, and may have been very real to C.P. Cavafy. But the Alexandria that the characters and what Darley is going to find when he arrives there is going to be his Alexandria. It's not going to be C.P. Cavafy's Alexandria. And so in the same way, we have to sort of try and find that balance, I suppose, that we might be drawn to this imaginary place that's evoked in these books, but it's not necessarily the same place if we were to actually go there ourselves, particularly now since things have changed so much since. And I think the city is its own character, and it's, as a place, it's still very important to these characters. It's a place for them to try and find themselves in. It's a kind of surreal, but sometimes nightmarish, sometimes delightful playground for them. And it sort of serves its purpose for a time, but also the books kind of show how our relationship to a place changes over time, that they can serve us very well, help us potentially find ourselves or find a version of ourselves, and then we change and then we move on. And that's what really stayed with me the most. So I think I'll leave it there. I've been rattling on for quite some time, but I hope, if you've read it, I hope there's at least something interesting in there. Please let me know what you love about the quartet if you've read it, and I hope if you've made it this far and if you're intrigued, I hope you at least pick up one of them and give it a go. I think I would recommend reading it in the order of publication. Some people sometimes read them out of order, which would be intriguing. But I think it does work best when read in order of publication. So that was the Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.